folks, Ian, Part-Time Experience, welcome back. So I wanted to talk some about creating your own custom campaign and the campaign world that it will be in. When it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of players, dungeon masters, both new and old, they like being in custom homebrew worlds because, well, it's something different. It's not something that they can buy from the store and just run themselves. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with running pre-made games or being a dungeon master for pre-made games and not running your own custom games, but there is a level of charm when it comes to something that you have painstakingly made yourself. And a key thing to remember is when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons and creating a campaign, especially a custom one, the canvas itself that you're painting on is infinitely sized, with the borders only determined by the limits of your imagination. That's it. Sure, you have to make sure to, give this suspension of disbelief, because that's important not only in movies and video games, but also in writing in general, in the sense that if the audience, or the target audience, is not able to rationalize or believe what you're giving them, they may lose interest, because, well, it's not believable, or it's not striking the right chords with them. So, it's best to try and hammer things out. It's always good to start small and work your way outwards from there. Sure, you might want to build a massive multi-empire continent that has many wars and political intrigue going on, and that's perfectly valid. Don't let me say otherwise. Don't let anyone say otherwise. However, you need to start small to make sure you get things right. So, let's start small. I don't know about you, but in the current world, I have no idea who is on my city council. I barely know who the mayor is, and yeah, that's just a simple fact. I'm sure many other people out there feel the same, or they are in the same situation. Unless you're in a smaller town that is very close-knit, you're not going to know who's on the city council, and you're not going to know who the mayor is because you're just not involved. Which kind of is a bad thing, but at the same time, in today's modern day, those things don't hold as much power as they used to in the olden days. And a lot of D&D campaigns take place in kind of this strange early medieval, or rather early Victorian, late medieval era of sorts, or some sort of weird hodgepodge of the two. So, things like the mayor, the sheriff, the city council, the local judge, they had immense amounts of power. Huge amounts of power where they could get away with just about anything, or they could pass laws or rules, embargoes and tariffs, and they could dictate who could and could not come into the town. That was a huge thing back then. So, let's start with that. You essentially determine who is the mayor, who is the council members underneath them, if there is that kind of government there, who is the local judge, who is the local sheriff. Congratulations, you've got a semblance of a government right there. From there, you do like the clergy members for the local church, if they have a church. From there, you determine who runs the local, grocery store, who runs the general goods, and so forth. You essentially start from the most important to the least important, and you want roughly around 20 important NPCs. And then you draw out the town, you mark where everyone's going to normally be, and then you do it again. And then you do it again. And you do it again. You want to do this for about 7 to 8 towns. And then you choose one of them, or you create a whole new one, that you then elevate by conflating the numbers to much larger. That is your capital. Voila! You've got a kingdom. Or, a country of some sort. Now, there's different types of kingdoms, obviously. There's the standard monarchy. Then there's stuff like the Confederacy, a democracy, a dictatorship, feudalism. There's actually quite a number of different governments in this book. I know for one, I went with plutocracy with my main kingdom that I ran my previous games in, which is Aloria. It was ran by 7 families who essentially had a singular individual as a mouthpiece for them, but for the most part, the 7 families held all of the power, because they were the richest and most powerful of everyone in the kingdom. They owned the land. You were just renting it from them, really. But when it comes to creating your own government, you can choose from any of these, but that is essentially still the same stepping stones that I would suggest using for creating your own essentially custom campaign. Start on the immediate area that your players are going to be in, dictate who is going to be like the form of government over that town, build out around there, create more towns using the same process, determine population sizes for each, and then make it one more and make it like 4 to 5 times bigger. Doing that, you've now created essentially a capital with a number of subholdings that essentially, support it, and if you mark them out right, you've got borders. Another way of doing borders often is natural landmarks such as rivers, mountains, things like that. So it's very important to keep those in mind when you're trying to determine how the kingdom is essentially built up, but also how it affects the culture and the people there. So, depending on the land that the kingdom is on, also determines how the kingdom's rules work. If they've made a lot of their money from mining and essentially stonework, then they're going to have rules that benefit stoneworking and mining and getting, rough gems and such way more than they are going to have when it comes to logging or trade, which is, also a major thing that they need to keep in mind, especially if they are going to be either isolated or inclusive. If they're isolated from the other kingdoms, that's going to severely hamper trade, and such they're going to have stricter trade laws as well as, inflated prices for things that they are importing, and when it comes to exporting, they probably won't be as fair to their, citizens. These are things to keep in mind. Everyone hates the tax man because the tax man eventually comes for you. Eventually comes for you. But still, it's key to keep these things in mind, such as if you're in a place that is very hard to get fresh water, water is going to be worth just as much as gold then. If you're in a place where wood is very hard to get, then again, wood is going to be worth more. If you're in a place that gets good gems, like, tiger's eyes, hematites, diamonds, so on and so forth, opals, if they are able to get those and essentially make, say, any kind of craft like rings, earrings, figurines, and so on from those things, then they are going to essentially have those in excess to where it's going to be cheaper to get those things versus the things that they can't get, things that they have to import. And again, this affects the culture in the sense that they will hold things that are harder to get in higher value. Case in point, I remember one time I had a kingdom that's still in the back burner, I haven't used it yet, but essentially they held lumber at a higher value than they did stone. Stone was easy for them to get. There was massive quarries all over that they could just dig from. But lumber was difficult because the area that they in just didn't naturally grow trees. So they had to import lumber. It was very expensive to import lumber. Because of this, they tended to essentially unfairly tax any imports or exports of lumber because they wanted to retain it as much as possible. And because of this, the Lumbers Guild that eventually formed there had way more bargaining power than the Stonemasons Guild, even though the Stonemason Guild essentially built up the town. So, things like that to keep in mind. Another thing is also currency. When it comes to different kingdoms, sometimes they have different types of currency. And it's important to keep that in mind because, well, hey, I know you've got this old gold to bloom, but it's not legal tender, so we're not going to accept it. Or better yet, we're going to charge you with theft for having it. Things from real life, but also make sense in the old world. They wouldn't accept certain currency because it wasn't of their, denomination or of their dominion, so they just rejected it outright. Or they would accept it, but at a discounted price. It's like, you've got a Roman coin, but, welcome to France, that's not worth anything. Or it's worth half of what, the French use. And that's also true when it comes to Dungeons & Dragons. Now, you don't have to go with this route. I would like to point that out as well. You don't have to go with the idea that coins have different value based upon where they're from. I know I've thought about doing it, but I myself have not, purely because of the idea of my players having to deal with that extra layer of frustration of not only do they have enough coins, do they have the right coins in order to actually purchase things that they need, especially when they need to get rations or they need to get certain upgrades for their equipment, but they just aren't in the same place that they started. My players in my previous campaign started in Aloria, a major trade capital, a major guild capital of the entire continent. They have lots of money, lots of guilds, lots of everything. Gold was the language essentially. But if I made it to where if they brought those gold coins over to Townion, which they eventually did, and said, hey, Townion doesn't use the same currency exchange as you, so your coins are worth less than normal, or they're worth more than normal, that would completely change up how the players were going to interact with the rest of the campaign. It would become either they had to work harder to get more money because they were just constantly under, or they would have to, make things more difficult for me because they were buying, huge ships left and right with no issue whatsoever. Key things to keep in mind. So that's something else you need to keep in mind when it comes to your government. Because while you might not do the different currencies, trade is still very important when it comes to two different kingdoms. If you end up having your players cross over to another kingdom, either legally or illegally, there's going to be moments where it's like, hey, you've got this item, it's not permitted within these borders. And it's like, well, it's this item. Yeah, it's not allowed here. Our laws are different. Key things to keep in mind, helps add a little flavor, as well as gives you another writing hook, so on and so forth. But that's kind of how you want to start out with creating your own campaign world. Start small, start on the small towns, what laws that they have, who's in charge, and what adventures are there also, because you can use those to either hook the players towards a overarching theme, or you can use it to determine how the players are going to be viewed by the rest of the town and eventually the rest of the kingdom as word spreads. Anyways, laters.